Introduction to Pechorin's Journal. I learned not long ago that Pechorin had died on his way back from Persia. This news gladdened me very much. It gave me the right to publish these notes, and I took advantage of the opportunity to sign another man's work with my own name. God grant that readers do not castigate me for such an innocent forgery. I now must explain somehow the reasons that prompted me to deliver to the public the innermost secrets of a man whom I had never known. It might have been all right had I been his friend. The perfidious indiscreetness of a true friend is intelligible to anyone, but I saw him only once in my life, on the highway, and consequently cannot harbor for him that ineffable detestation which, concealed under the mask of friendship, only awaits death or misfortune to befall the beloved But I saw him only once in my life on the highway, and consequently cannot harbor for him that ineffable detestation which, concealed under the mask of friendship, only awaits death or misfortune to befall the beloved object in order to break out over his head in a hail of reproach, advice, jibes, and lamentations. While reading over these notes, I became convinced of the sincerity of this man who so mercilessly exhibited his own failings and vices. The history of a human soul, be it even the meanest soul, can hardly be less curious or less instructive than the history of an entire nation, especially when it is the result of self-observation on the part of a mature mind, and when it is written without the ambitious desire to provoke sympathy or amazement. Rousseau's Confessions have already the defect of his having read them to his friends. Thus, solely the desire to be useful compelled me to print excerpts from a journal that came accidentally into my possession. Although I altered all proper names, these people of whom it tells will probably recognize themselves, and possibly they will find some justification in regard to actions for which until now they blamed a man who, henceforth, has nothing in common with our world. We nearly always excuse what we can understand. I have included in this book only that which refers to Pechorin's sojourn in the Caucasus. There still remains in my possession a fat notebook wherein he narrates all his life. Someday it too will be presented to the judgment of the world, but for the present there are important reasons why I dare not assume such a responsibility. Perhaps some readers will want to know my opinion of Pechorin's character. My answer is the title of this book. But this is wicked irony, they will say. I wonder. Taman. Taman is the worst little town of all the seacoast towns in Russia. I almost died of hunger there, and moreover an attempt was made to drown me. I arrived late one night with post horses in a small springless carriage. The driver stopped his tired troika at the gate of the only stone house in Taman, at the town entrance. The sentinel, a Black Sea Cossack, startled in his sleep by the jingle of the harness bell, yelled out in a wild voice, "Who goes there?" A sergeant and a corporal appeared. I explained to them that I was an officer going on official business to join a detachment on active duty, and demanded governmental quarters. The corporal took me over the town. Every hut we drove up to proved taken. The weather was cold. I had not slept for 3 nights. I was worn out and was beginning to get angry. "Take me somewhere, you rascal," I cried. "Let it be the devil's, but lead me to the place." "There is one more fatera quarters," replied the corporal, scratching the back of his head. "But your honor won't like it. It's an evil place." I did not understand the exact sense of that word and ordered the man to go ahead. After wandering for a long time along dirty alleys where on both sides I could see nothing but decrepit fences, we drove up to a shanty on the very edge of the sea. The full moon shone on the rush roof and the whitewashed walls of my new abode. In the yard, within an enclosure of cobbles, there stood, all awry, a second hut, smaller and more ancient than the first. Almost at its very walls, the shore fell abruptly toward the sea. and below, with an incessant murmur, the dark blue waves plashed. The moon mildly surveyed the element, both restless and submissive to her, and by her light I could distinguish far from the shore 2 ships whose motionless black rigging was outlined, gossamer-like, against the pale horizon. There are ships in the harbor, I said to myself. Tomorrow I'll set out for Gelendzhik. I had in my service as orderly a Cossack from a line regiment. I told him to take out my valise and to dismiss the coachman. Then I began calling the landlord. Silence. I knocked. Silence again. Funny situation. Finally, a boy of 14 or so crept out of the hallway. Where's the landlord? No landlord. How's that? None at all? None. And what about a landlady? Gone to the settlement. Then who'll open the door for me? I asked and gave it a kick. The door opened of itself. A whiff of dampness came from within. I lit a sulfur match and brought it close to the lad's very nose. It illumined 2 white eyes. He was blind, totally blind from birth. He stood motionless before me, and I began to examine his features. I confess I have a strong prejudice against those who are blind, one-eyed, deaf, mute, legless, armless, hunchbacked, and so forth. I have observed that there always exists some strange relationship between the appearance of a man and his soul. As if with the loss of a limb, the soul lost one of its senses, and so I began to examine the blind lad's face. But what can one read in the face that lacks eyes? For a long time I kept looking at him with involuntary pity, when all of a sudden a hardly perceptible smile ran over his thin lips, and for some reason it made on me a most unpleasant impression. There was born in my mind the suspicion that this blind lad was not as blind as it seemed. In vain did I try to persuade myself that those white eyes could not be faked, and what would have been the purpose? But I could not help wondering. I am often inclined to prejudice. Are you the landlady's son? I asked him at last. No. Who are you then? An orphan, a cripple. And does the landlady have any children? No. There was a daughter, but she's run off across the sea with a tater. What tater? The evil one knows. Some tater from the Crimea. A boatman from Kerch. I entered the shanty. 2 benches and a table, plus a huge trunk by the stove, made up all its furniture. Not one icon hung on the wall, a bad sign. The sea breeze kept blowing through the broken window pane. I took out of my suitcase a bit of wax candle, and having lit it, began to unpack my things. I placed in one corner of the room my sword and rifle, laid my pistols on the table, spread my felt cloak on one bench. My Cossack spread his on the other. 10 minutes later he began to snore, but I could not fall asleep. The white-eyed lad kept hovering before me in the dark. About an hour passed in this way. The moon shone in the window, and one beam played on the earthen floor of the shanty. Suddenly, upon the bright band that crossed the floor, a shadow flicked by. I raised myself and glanced through the window. Once again someone ran past and vanished. God knows where. I could not suppose that this creature had run down the steep slope of the shore. However, there was no other place for it to have gone. I got up, put on my bejmet, buckled my dagger on, and as softly as possible stepped out of the shanty. The blind lad appeared before me. I huddled beside the fence, and he went by me with a firm but cautious step. He carried a bundle under his arm. Turning toward the harbor, he began to go down the narrow, steep path. On that day the dumb shall cry out and the blind shall see, I thought, as I followed him at a distance which allowed me not to lose sight of him. Meanwhile, the moon had begun to clothe herself in clouds, and above the sea a mist had risen. Through it a lantern glimmered on the stern of the nearer ship. Close to the beach there gleamed the foam of the breakers which threatened to flood it at any minute. Descending with difficulty, I groped my way down the precipitous slope, and this is what I saw. The blind lad stopped for a moment, then turned to the right at the bottom of the slope. He walked so close to the water that it looked as if any moment a wave might seize him and carry him away. But evidently this was not the first time he took this walk, judging by the assuredness with which he stepped from stone to stone and avoided holes. Finally he stopped as if listening to something, sat down on the ground, and laid down the bundle beside him. I followed his movements as I stood concealed behind a projecting part of the rocky coast. After a few minutes, a white figure came in sight from the opposite direction. It advanced toward the blind lad and sat down beside him. From time to time, the wind brought me snatches of their conversation. "Well, blind one," said a woman's voice, "the storm is heavy. Yanko will not come." "Yanko does not fear the storm," the other replied. "The mist is getting thicker," the woman's voice retorted with a note of sadness. "A mist is best for slipping past the patrol ships," was the answer. "And what if he drowns?" "Well, what of it? You'll go to church Sunday without a new ribbon." There followed a silence. One thing, however, had struck me. To me, the blind lad had spoken in the Ukrainian dialect. Now he expressed himself in perfect Russian. "You see, I was right," spoke the blind lad again, clapping his hands together. "Yanko is not afraid either of the sea or the winds or the mist or the coast guards. Listen! That is not water splashing. One cannot deceive me. It's his long oars." The woman jumped up and began to peer into the distance with an air of anxiety. "You're dreaming, blind one," she said. "I don't see anything. I confess that no matter how I strained to make out in the distance anything resembling a boat, my efforts were in vain." Some 10 minutes elapsed. Then, amid the mountains of the waves, a black dot appeared. It grew now bigger, now smaller, slowly rising upon the wave crests and rapidly coming down them. A boat was nearing the shore. He must be a valiant navigator indeed to venture on such a night to cross the straits, a distance of 15 miles, and it must be an important reason that induced him to do so. These were my thoughts as, with an involuntary throbbing of the heart, I looked at the wretched boat. But she kept diving like a duck, and then, with a wing-like upsweep of oars, would spring out of the abyss amid a burst of foam. And now, I thought, her impetus will dash her against the shore, and she will be smashed to bits. But cleverly she turned sideways and bounded unharmed into a cove. A man of medium height and a tater cap of sheepskin came ashore. He waved his hand, and all three began to drag something out of the boat. The load was so great that to this day I cannot understand how she had not sunk. Each having shouldered a bundle, they started to walk away along the coast, and I soon lost sight of them. I had to go back to my lodgings, but I confess all these strange things worried me, and I had a hard time awaiting the morning. My Cossack was much surprised when upon waking he saw me all dressed. I did not, however, tell him the reason. After admiring for a while from the window the blue sky strewn with torn cloudlets and the distant shore of the Crimea, which extended in a lilac line and ended in a rock on the summit of which a lighthouse loomed white, I made my way to Fanagoria. Fort to find out from the commandant the hour of my departure for Glindzek. But alas, the commandant could tell me nothing definite. The ships that lay in the harbor were either patrol ships or merchantmen that had not even begun to load. "Maybe within 3 or 4 days the mailboat will come," said the commandant, "and then we shall see." I returned home, gloomy and cross. In the doorway, my Cossack met me with a frightened face. "It's a bad business, sir," he said to me. "Yes, my friend, the Lord knows when we shall get out of here." At this he became even more perturbed, and bending toward me, said in a whisper, "It's an evil place. Today I met a Black Sea sergeant. He's a friend of mine who was in our detachment last year. The moment I told him where we were quartered, he said to me, 'Brother, it's an evil place. Those are bad people.' And true enough, what kind of a blind man is this? Goes alone everywhere, to the market, to get bread, to get water. Seems all are used to it around here." "Well, at least did the landlady show up? When you were out today, there came an old woman and her daughter." "What daughter? She has no daughter." "The Lord knows who she is then, if she is not her daughter. Anyway, the old woman is in here. She's in her hut now." I entered the smaller hut. The stove had been thoroughly heated, and in it a dinner was cooking, fairly luxurious for paupers. To all my questions, the old woman replied that she was deaf, could not hear me. What was I to do with her? I turned to the blind lad who sat before the stove, feeding the fire with brushwood. "Well now, you blind little devil," I said, taking him by the ear. "Out with it. Where did you go prowling last night with that bundle, eh?" All at once my blind lad began to weep, to shriek, to moan. Where did I go? Nowhere at all. With a bundle? What bundle? This time the old woman did hear and began to grumble. What things people will make up. And about a poor cripple, too. Why are you after him? What has he done to you? I got tired of this and left, firmly resolved to obtain the key to this riddle. I wrapped myself in my felt cloak and, seating myself on a stone beside the fence, fell to looking idly afar. In front of me there spread the sea, stirred up by last night's storm, and its monotonous sound, akin to the murmur of a city settling down to sleep, reminded me of past years and carried my thoughts northward toward our cold capital. I was troubled by memories and lost myself in them. Thus passed an hour, perhaps even more. Suddenly something resembling a song struck my hearing. It was indeed a song, and the limpid young voice was that of a woman, but where did it come from? I listened. The tune was bizarre, now slow and sad, now fast and lively. I turned. There was no one around. Again I listened. The sounds seemed to fall from the sky. I raised my eyes. On the roof of my hut stood a girl in a striped dress, her hair hanging loose, a regular water nymph. Shading her eyes from the rays of the sun with the palm of her hand, she fixedly peered afar, now laughing and reasoning with herself, now singing her song. I memorized that song word for word. Over the free franchise of the green sea, good ships keep going, white-sailed. Among those good ships is my own small boat, a boat unrigged, two-oared. Let a storm run riot, the old ships will lift their wings and scatter over the sea. To the sea I shall bow, to the sea I shall bow very low. You, bad sea, do not touch my small boat. My small boat carries costly things. It is guided through the dark night by a bold daredevil. Involuntarily, the thought struck me that last night I had heard the same voice. I was lost in meditation for a moment, and when I looked again at the roof, the girl was no longer there. All at once she ran past me, singing some other snatch, and then, snapping her fingers, ran into the old woman's hut, upon which a dispute rose between them. The old woman was furious. The girl laughed loudly. Presently I saw my Undine skip out again. On coming up level with me, she stopped and looked fixedly into my eyes as if she were surprised at my presence. Then she turned away casually and slowly walked toward the harbor. This was not the end. All day long she hovered about my dwelling. Her singing and skipping did not cease for 1 minute. What an odd creature she was. Her face showed no signs of insanity. On the contrary, her eyes rested upon me with brisk perspicacity. Those eyes, it seemed, were endowed with some kind of magnetic power, and every time they looked, they seemed to be waiting for a question. But barely did I begin to speak, then she would run away with a crafty smile. Really, I had never seen such a woman. She was far from beautiful, but I have my preconceptions in regard to beauty, too. She revealed a good deal of breeding, and breeding in women, as in horses, is a great thing. Les jeunes France are responsible for this discovery. It, that is breeding, not young France, is most visible in the gait, in the hands and feet. The nose is especially significant. In Russia, a straight nose is rarer than a small foot. My songstress did not appear to be more than 18. The extraordinary suppleness of her figure, a special inclination of the head, peculiar to her alone, her long auburn hair, a kind of golden sheen on the slightly suntanned skin of her neck and shoulders, and especially her straight nose, all this was enchanting to me, although I detected in her oblique glances something wild and suspicious, and although there was an odd vagueness about her smile, still such is the force of preconception. Her straight nose drove me crazy. I imagined I had discovered Goethe's Mignon, that extravagant product of his German imagination. And indeed, there was a lot in common between them. The same rapid transitions from intense restlessness to complete immobility, the same enigmatic accents, the same capers and strange songs. Toward nightfall, I accosted her by the door and started the following conversation with her. "Tell me, my pretty girl," I said, "what were you doing today on the roof?" "Oh, just tried to see whence the wind was blowing." "What is that to you? Whence the wind comes, happiness comes too." "So you are inviting happiness with your song?" "Where there are songs, there is happiness. And what if you chance to sing sorrow in?" "What of it?" "Where it will not get better, it will get worse, and then again, it is not far from bad to good." "And who taught you that song?" "Nobody taught me. I sing when I feel like singing. He who is meant to hear it will hear, and he who is not will not understand." "And what's your name, my songstress?" The one who christened me knows." "And who christened you?" "How should I know?" "What reticence! Yet look, there is something I've found out about you." Her face did not change, her lips did not move, as if I were not speaking of her. "I've found out that you went down to the shore last night." At this point I very solemnly related to her all I had seen, expecting she would be taken aback. Not in the least. She burst into roars of laughter. "You've seen much, but you know little," she said. "And whatever you do know, you'd better keep under lock. And what if, for instance, I took it into my head to inform the commandant?" At this point I assumed a very serious, even severe expression. Suddenly off she hopped, broke into song, and vanished like some little bird that has been flushed out of the shrubbery. My last words had been entirely out of place. At the time I did not realize all their importance, but later had a chance to regret them. It had just got dark. I ordered the Cossack to heat the tea kettle, bivouac fashion, lit a candle, and sat down at the table, quietly puffing at my traveling pipe. By the time I was finishing my second glass of tea, the door creaked suddenly, and I heard, behind me, the light rustle of a dress and the sound of steps. I started and turned around. It was she, my Undine. Softly, silently, she sat down, facing me across the table, and fixed me with her eyes, and I do not know why, but her look seemed to me wondrously tender. It reminded me of those gazes which, in past years, so despotically toyed with my life. She seemed to be waiting for a question, but I remained silent, filled with an ineffable confusion. A dull pallor betraying inner agitation covered her face. Her hand strayed over the table aimlessly, and I noticed a slight tremor in it. Now her bosom would rise high, and now she would seem to be holding her breath. This comedy was beginning to bore me, and I was prepared to break the silence in a most prosaic way, that is, to offer her a glass of tea, when she suddenly jumped up, twined her arms around my neck, and a moist, burning kiss sounded upon my lips. Everything turned dark before my eyes. My head swam. I crushed her in my embrace with all the force of youthful passion, but she, like a snake, glided between my arms, whispering in my ear, "Tonight, when everybody is asleep, come on to the shore," and like an arrow sped out of the room. In the hallway she overturned the kettle and a candle which stood on the floor. "That she-devil!" cried the Cossack, who had made himself comfortable on some straw and had been looking forward to warming himself with the remainder of the tea. Only then did I come to my senses. Some 2 hours later, when everything had quieted down in the harbor, I roused my Cossack. "If I fire my pistol," I told him, "come down to the shore as fast as you can." His eyes bulged, and he answered automatically, "At your orders, sir." I stuck a pistol in my belt and went out. She was waiting for me at the edge of the declivity. Her garment was more than light. A flimsy kerchief girded her supple figure. "Follow me," she said, taking me by the hand, and we started to walk down. I wonder that I did not break my neck. Once below, we turned right and went along the same road along which I had tracked the blind lad on the previous night. The moon had not yet risen, and only two little stars, like two guiding beacons, sparkled in the dark blue vault. Heavy waves rolled rhythmically and evenly, one after the other. hardly raising the lone boat that was moored to the shore. "Let's get into the boat," said my companion. I hesitated. I am no amateur of sentimental promenades on the sea. But this was not the moment to retreat. She jumped into the boat. I followed, and had barely recovered my senses when I noticed that we were adrift. "What does this mean?" I said crossly. "It means," she said, making me sit on a bench and winding her arms around my waist, "it means that I love you." Her cheek pressed mine, and I felt on my face her flaming breath. Suddenly something fell into the water. With a noisy splash, my hand flew to my belt. My pistol was gone. Oh, what a terrible suspicion stole into my soul. The blood rushed to my head. I looked around. We were 100 yards from the shore, and I could not swim. I tried to push her away, but she clung to my clothes like a cat, and suddenly a powerful push almost precipitated me overboard. The boat rocked, but I regained my balance, and a desperate struggle started between us. My rage gave me strength, but I soon realized that in agility I was inferior to my adversary. "What do you want?" I cried, squeezing her small hands hard. Her fingers crunched, but she did not cry out. Her serpent nature withstood this torture. "You saw," she replied. "You will tell." And with a superhuman effort, she brought me crashing down against the side of the boat. We both hung over from the waist up. Her hair touched the water. It was a decisive moment. I braced my knee against the bottom of the boat. With one hand I seized her by the hair. With the other got hold of her throat. She released my clothes, and I instantly shoved her into the waves. By that time it was rather dark. Once or twice I glimpsed her head amid the foam, and then I saw nothing more. At the bottom of the boat I found one half of an old oar, and after protracted effort somehow managed to reach the landing place. As I made my way along the shore toward my hut, I could not help peering into the direction where on the eve the blind lad had waited for the nocturnal navigator. The moon was already riding the sky, and it seemed to me that someone in white sat on the shore. Egged on by curiosity, I stole close up and lay in the grass on the brink of the steep shore. Sticking out my head a little, I could clearly see from the cliff all that took place below, and was not much surprised, but felt almost glad to recognize my mermaid. She was wringing the wet foam out of her long hair. Her wet shift outlined her supple figure and raised breasts. In the distance there soon appeared a boat. Quickly it approached. Out of it, as on the night before, there stepped a man in a tater cap, but with his hair cut in the Cossack fashion, and a large knife sticking out of his leather belt. "Yanko," she said, "all is lost." After this their conversation continued, but in such low tones that I could not make out a word of it. "And where's the blind one?" Yanko said at last, raising his voice. "I sent him on an errand," was the answer. A few minutes later the blind lad appeared, hauling on his back a sack which they put into the boat.